This podcast is brought to you in association with Niyogi Books.
Welcome back to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today I have with us Vaasanthi, one of the leading writers and columnists from Tamil Nadu. She's been the editor of the Tamil edition of India Today for over 10 years and has published 30 novels, 6 short story collections, and 4 volumes of journalistic articles. She's also written a very popular biography on Jayalalitha, Rajnikant, and Karunanidhi. Today I'm going to talk to her about her latest collection of short stories published by Niyogi Books, titled Ganga's Choice and Other Stories. It's an intense collection of short stories dealing with issues faced by ordinary people and the strength they exercise while carrying out regular decisions, which may seem plain vanilla to us, but are actual difficult choices these people are making in their day to day life. Without taking anything away from the short stories, let's jump right into the interview. Hello, Vasanthi ma'am, and welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. I'm so glad to have you today. Um it's been
Thank you,
a
sir.
it's been a really
Thank you.
interesting experience reading your book because, and I must admit, this is a fault I possess, and I think it goes without saying for a lot of people in metropolitan cities who've grown up in English-speaking schools, that they do not really interact a lot more with literature that's written in regional languages or other languages. Actually, regional languages is actually an incorrect way of talking about those languages, and such translations allow us access into a very different world, because I believe languages give you an insight into a very interesting culture which probably you might not be exposed to. So reading your work was very interesting. So just to kick off the interview, if I could ask you to describe Ganga's Choice and this particular collection of short stories in maybe 1 minute, how would you go about it? What would be your summary or your description of this book?
No, I have been wanting to bring out such a collection for a long time, but then I was so preoccupied with my other works and all that, I just couldn't get the time. During the pandemic, because of the lockdown and all the things that were going around and all, we couldn't go out, we couldn't do much. Then it was very depressing. And during that time, I was wondering why I shouldn't take up this kind of, trying to bring out a collection. The stories that you see in this collection were written during a period of time. It was not, just one collection written at one period of time. It was in the course of several years, during the course of several years. But then I picked these stories that I like. I thought must reach to an audience that is not aware of what the regional writers write.
Right.
You see, translation is very important. It is a vehicle to reach you. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what I write about. And also, you will have a kind of a glimpse of the culture that is beyond the Vindhyas, if I can say so, isn't it? Of course, I have written about other areas as well, about this, for example, the line of control, and also that steering wheel that happens in the US. And so there are certain stories like that. But then the cultural ethos is mainly of the South.
Mhm.
I thought, something that gives a kind of an indirect message,
Mhm.
something humane, something that will connect to the
Mhm.
values, basic values, basic human values are all same all over the world.
Right.
And so it only has to, we express it in different languages and different ways and different formats, but then the basic is the same, isn't it? So that is how I thought I will bring out a collection like this. And then, as I told you, this was written over a period of time. And I selected these stories,
Mhm.
and I I started the job of finding out translators, and but then when the translation came to me, I worked on them also quite a great deal because I'm familiar with the language,
Right.
English language.
But ma'am, that actually brings me to one of my other questions, which I was going to get to, but I'm glad we got there earlier. So, because you were familiar with the language itself, why did you not go about doing the translating on your own? Why did you decide to have a external translator, if I may ask?
That is a good question. I have translated one story,
Mm-hmm.
the Dance of Gods. I've translated. You see, translating yourself is quite a tedious affair, because you have to, it's very difficult to go back to the atmosphere, the intensity with which you
Right.
wrote the story,
Right.
to relive those emotions,
Right.
the same kind of intensity is very difficult to go through. And besides, during the period, I can write another story, a
Mhm.
fresh story.
Right.
So if I give it to a translator, the translator gives me a structure, isn't it? I mean, if the person is very good, I mean, an experienced translator, I have no work at all. I don't
Right.
need to do anything over that. But the Sukanya Venkatraman is a is new to translation, but she was very eager. She was very eager. She lives in the US, and she was very eager to translate, and someone recommended her name, so I asked her to translate. They were fairly good, but then I had to work quite a lot over the translations to bring out the nuances. She
Right.
may not be.
Exactly what I was getting at. Like the bit that you mentioned, you started off by saying that it's difficult to go back to the emotions that you felt while writing the book, or
Yeah.
or the story. But I think that's one more step that often gets lost for the translator, right? I mean, who better than the writer herself to kind of capture the emotions she was feeling when she was writing something? But I do understand where you're coming from, and I think that's a perennial battle all of us will always have with translation. Is it ever possible to truly capture the essence of a story or like a novel or anything that's being translated by any translator? Because there's always, I mean, as the saying goes, lost in translation, right? There is something that always gets going. But I'm glad that you had an opportunity to go over the translation and even correct it, because
No,
that
but translation is a very difficult job. It is very
absolutely,
difficult.
absolutely. So
But the fact that it has reached you means that it has succeeded to a certain extent, isn't it?
Absolutely, ma'am. And I think, and that is, it's a very fine line to walk. And I think the translator has done a superb job here. It's always a very interesting area to explore, and that's a question that always stays on my mind. That so I've read a lot of translations from Japan, right? Once when with the rise of Murakami in popular literature, and you always had Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whose work was. But ever since I started thinking about it, I'm always under the conundrum whether I'm actually reading about Japanese culture, or am I reading the translator's perspective of Japanese culture, right? That layer actually hindering something, and that's, I think, always uh, going to be something in a bridge that we have to cross when we get there. But ma'am, I'll take a step back and come to the content of your book and your short stories, because something that I experienced while reading them was uh, they were quite direct and blunt. I mean, they did not mince their words while describing things. They were poetic, but they did not mince words at all. There were times when I had goosebumps while reading certain stories, uh, imagining what was happening, and I think that was an excellent way of communicating with the reader. But did you ever feel a certain sense of pressure while writing these stories in terms of leading to, say, more cheerful conclusions? Because that's something that I noticed, that as well written as the stories are, uh, they don't not all of them end on a very positive note. They might end on a scary note, or might leave you just slightly, maybe not disturbed, not the correct word, but slightly unsettled, maybe. So was that a deliberate choice you made, or maybe was there any pressure on you internally, not even from anyone else, but just to kind of write in a particular manner?
Um, many people ask me this, but it is not deliberate, or nor was there any pressure. But the thing is, I cannot explain it to you. Whether if you will believe me, the story writes itself. The end comes on its own. For instance, in the story testimony,
Mhm.
testimony, the story builds up. The momentum builds up to such a height that you expect the girl to reveal what happened, the reveal the truth. But then my story didn't end that way. Finally, she backs out. She succumbs to the pressures. I mean, so many. They are all. It is a murderous kind of a pressure around her, and there are only. And even the judge asks if the remaining members are only her mother and her brother. Are they only the two that remain in your family? That hits her hard. And so she, at that moment, she says that she has nothing to say and whatever she had said was a lie and all that. Some people asked me why I ended the story like that. But the story had to end that way. I put myself in her place, and then I wondered what I would do. Supposing somebody says, "This is a," if you say something against us, we will see that you don't have even these people left out in your family. And so she doesn't want to lose that. She doesn't want to lose her that security circle that she has now. And so I felt that I would also back out. And the story wrote itself. The end came on its own. That's what happens to many of my stories. It is not a deliberate attempt to finish the story that way, but then after the story finishes and I read again, then I feel this would be the best way to end the story.
Right.
That is how it is.
Right.
Yeah, I know. But there is always a hope. There is a ray of hope hidden in all these things. There is something
Right.
humane, because the very fact that she fights inside herself the against the injustice, how she rages against the injustice done to her family, that itself is a kind of an awakening of the soul, isn't it?
Yes,
It is
exactly.
a kind of an awakening.
Right.
So that is there in everything, even in the dance of gods. That woman, she ends her life. That is all suicides. Psychiatrists say suicides are the result of a anger. It is because of an anger inside, anger against the community, against society, against someone. And this woman has a raging fury inside her at the kind of injustice done to women by the community. The men are not even conscious of what they are doing. And so it is a kind of a betrayal. They suspect her, and the husband says, I can't protect you. And so it is, that is the only way. By hurting herself, she shows her anger against the society. So I feel there is a humane thing, there is something to learn about. Something to say that you have to rethink, reinvent your mythologies. Those people are living in the mythic age.
Right.
They say they are the descendants of the Pandavas, and so she has to behave like Draupadi, Panchali.
Right. No, and ma'am,
I have been to that village. I have been to that village. I have
right,
seen it.
right,
But of course, my story is my own, but this is how the society is there till today.
right. No, ma'am, because and that's something I couldn't help but think of, that your stories are actually about humans rather than superhumans. Because when we read stories of struggle and people suffering about things, and you find people taking bold steps, or steps that set them free, or they're fighting against society, or even the most basic example, the first one we started off with, testimony, where you know the superhuman story would have been, yes, she stood up to everyone and gave the testimony and was this brave person who could stand up to her oppressors. But the fact of life is actually a little different, and it is exactly in line with what you're saying, that people tend to have a lot more humane reactions about things. And I think that's also a great part of literature, that it allows you to reflect on how things are and take those little rays of hope from your interpretations of it. And ma'am, coming to my next question, which you somewhat mentioned a bit right now when you mentioned that you've been to that village and seen that society. But a lot of the stories talk about things which a person can either learn through research or through personal experiences or hearing accounts. So, what was it for you? Was there research involved in terms of like looking up these things, or were you basing your stories on accounts that you've heard of, or I don't know, was some of the stories stemming from personal experiences or family experiences? What was it?
All writers write, I mean, from their own experiences, lived in experiences of what they see, what they have heard, what they have seen, basically. And I have been a journalist also. You see, I was the editor of India Today Tamil edition for nearly 10 years in Chennai. And I have never been in Tamil Nadu for a stretch of a period because I grew up in Karnataka. I was born and brought up there, and I never lived in Tamil Nadu, though paradoxically I was a Tamil writer from the beginning. And still, this opportunity was a great one for me, this 10-year sojourn in Tamil Nadu. I went to all corners of Tamil Nadu at that time, rural areas and all that, to do stories. We call stories, all the articles written in magazines, we call them stories. I went to do certain stories, you see, about female infanticide, and then a large family which had 145 members, something very strange. I thought I will write about the family. So when I went there to all these villages, it was something new for me. I've never seen, so I have never been to such rural areas before. I'm a urbanite basically, grew up in Bangalore and lived in Delhi and then went to Chennai. And so I've never been to all these rural areas, and this was something. It told me a different story of women, the pressures, the patriarchal pressures they were under, and how they were frustrated because they could not get away from all of them. And I wondered, I mean, I could sense their anger and frustration because I have been a creative writer from the beginning. So I could see them as a creative writer, like a storyteller. But after coming back from all those tours, I would just write sociological stories for the magazine. And all these memories of images stayed in my subconscious. And later, they were born as short stories. They were all lived in experiences, actually.
Right. Right. So, ma'am, just I have one quick question for you, which sort of slightly deviates from the topic, but it just popped in my head, so I have to ask this. So, hypothetically, if you couldn't write, right? For example, you mean you've been a journalist and you've been a very creative writer all your life, but if I take that away, if I take away the possibility of you being a writer, which other art form do you think you would have expressed yourself in?
I don't know. I used to sing, I can sing, but
Okay.
not anymore. But then, dance, music, and all I've learned.
Right.
But then it is only when writing I feel the complete satisfaction.
Right.
That is, I would even paint
Okay.
before, but then it is writing that I find my full satisfaction. So I
Right.
really can't say.
Right.
Maybe I could I'm a storyteller, basically.
Right. Okay. So, ma'am, but okay, this is something that I have generally noticed, and in most cases, it's true. Where and it's just a narrative that I like to believe in, that most writers are also voracious readers. So, is that
Yes,
true in your case as well? Are you
yes.
or do you
From
like reading?
childhood, yeah, from being very young, I used to read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even when I was in class 8, I had finished reading Jane Austen and Bronte sisters and Alexander Dumas and all that. I mean, at one go, Charles Dickens and all that. So I keep reading a lot. So that is a great help. It is also a learning process.
Of course.
We can see how the others write and all. Of course, you cannot
Right.
copy anybody. I mean, each one has a unique style and all.
Right.
Um, so I am at the moment I am reading Salman Rushdie's Keyshot,
Okay.
and so it's so funny, so funny. His English is so beautifully funny.
Absolutely.
So I cannot even imagine that I can write such prose.
Right.
So
Okay.
yeah, writers are readers. Yes.
So, ma'am, I mean, you'd have had the great opportunity of exploring a vast body of literature throughout your life. So, have were there any books in particular that stood out for you? I mean, the ones which I won't ask you to name your top 5 or top 10 books or favorite books, but books that really impacted you as a person, maybe shaped your journey as a writer, or kind of really shaped your moral fabric, or I don't know, books that have just stood the test of time for you.
Once I was very moved many years ago on this book on Cry My Beloved Country. So this kind of a books sometimes shake you from
Right.
inside. So otherwise, I like all kinds of books. I mean, all most of the Booker Prize books and all I like to read and all that. I cannot at once name what are the books now, but then this Cry the Beloved Country stands out in my memory. I wept when I read it.
Right.
And so I always think whenever there are happenings here, human rights violations and all that, that heading of the book always comes to me, Cry My Beloved Country.
Right.
So
Ma'am, and I have another question for you, because again, you straddle this very unique world of writing both in Tamil and understanding the English language enough to work on your own translation and writing in it. So this is something that has started happening, that happens across languages and genres, where there is a certain elitism to certain kinds of literature, right? I mean, certain kind of literature, like something like Rushdie or Arundhati Roy, are generally regarded as literature, while you would have a lot more, while as storytellers there are a lot more books which are written in simpler language, uh, maybe less difficult sentence structures, more the English is more simplified, or the language is generally more simplified, and the story is appeals directly to the people, and people look down on such books or such forms of literature for various reasons. So, do you think it's to an extent justified, or do you think that this is actually a form of I don't know, a very elite form of discrimination? What's your take on this?
yeah, I personally feel there is space for everyone.
Right.
There is space because people are of different strata. They have different tastes. People in general have different tastes. And there was one, the elitist group that um, discouraged pop culture, and they said it was something demeaning and not up to the mark, and it has to be rejected. In Tamil Nadu also, there was a literary group that rejected pop culture and then popular writers and popular writing and all that. But I think there is space for everyone in this world. And then if someone likes only Arundhati Roy very well, then let them read Arundhati. But there are also others who every book has got its space. I think nothing can be. I mean, you cannot say that this is inferior or that is superior. Everything has got a niche, isn't it?
Right.
So I don't say that it is wrong. I mean, something inferior. There is nothing inferior or superior. Of course, there are. I mean, superior literature is always there. That is set apart.
Right.
But it is not to the taste of everyone, isn't it?
Right.
So everyone's taste has to be catered to.
So, ma'am, again, just we're heading towards the end of this interview, and I have a quick couple questions for you. Is there any particular writer in Tamil or in English or any other language, maybe a newer writer which has caught your eye, whose work seems very interesting to you, and that person appears to have a great future ahead of them? Is there anything that you've come across in the past 5-10 years?
There are plenty of writers. There are plenty of writers now, younger generation in Tamil also, because of the reservation that came very early in Tamil Nadu. A lot of writers from the backward community, from the Dalit community have all come up. There is one, Imayam, he writes very well. And so there are several others. And so it is a very good time for writing, I think. I cannot keep naming people that would be like to the exclusion of others, or also there whose work I am not very familiar with. It's not fair.
Fair enough, ma'am. No, and I'm glad you mentioned that it's a great time to be writer, because that brings us to the last question of the interview. What's next from your hands that we could be seeing soon? Is there another collection of short stories, or maybe a novel, anything that's coming out?
And maybe I'll write some short stories and novellas and all that. Do you know I have written a number of books in English?
Yes.
Just biographies I have written. Biographies on Jayalalitha, on Karunanidhi, on Rajinikanth. I've written about 5 books in English. Penguin, Aleph, and Juggernaut have published.
Right.
So they are there. Many people are still asking me to write some biographies, but I said no, thank you, because it's a very, very difficult job.
Right.
Because you don't please anyone. First of all, the subject. You don't please the subject you are writing about.
Of course.
After all your work, that is the name you get in the end. Jayalalitha took me to court. Did you know that?
No, I had no idea, ma'am. I had no idea about this.
Penguin asked me to write a book on her, but she wouldn't give me any interview at all, date for interview. Right. But then first I didn't want to write about her, but then, are you running short of time?
No, ma'am, we have time. Please don't worry about that.
So I started writing. It was very difficult, because it was very difficult to trace back to her past associations, and even the later bureaucrats who were associated with her, they were so scared of talking to me, because though she was not in power at that time when I was writing, because they were scared that she may come back to power, which she did, of course. It was very difficult to write a book, but somehow I managed to gather enough material, and I wrote the book. And then she got wind of it, because Outlook brought out a cover story on my book, calling it the untold story of Jayalalitha. She, without reading the book, when it was about to be released, 3 days prior to the release, she went to court and brought an injunction to the book release. So the injunction went on and on. The Penguin fought the case, but then with Jayalalitha back in power, even the courts were not very favorable towards a person like me. So they were all kind of. She was so powerful. So Penguin realized that it was fruitless to fight against such power, and so backed out. But it was only after her death, sadly, the injunction was lifted, and then the book was updated, and Penguin brought the book. Here, it is called this is the book.
Oh, right. The Lone. Correct.
The Lone Empress. So it is very difficult. I wrote on Karunanidhi also, but there was no case. And then I wrote a book on Rajinikanth. Aleph brought. So this man also didn't give me any interview.
Oh.
They are all so worried, They don't want anything to be written against them, But that is how it is. So no more biographies. So I'll go back to my short stories and novellas, which is the
well, I
safest.
think it's our loss that we're losing out on more biographies from you, but in a way our gain also that your short story we'll get to read more of your short stories. Thank you so much, ma'am, for doing this.
And thank you for liking my stories and interviewing me. Thank you.
Thank you.